Hi, everyone, and welcome to Your Stake, Your Story, a video series focused on highlighting best practices in values-based investing. Today, I'm really excited to be joined by Bill Davis. I've known Bill for quite a while and really happy to be talking with you today. Bill's a founder and portfolio manager at Stance Capital. He formed the firm to bring to market investment portfolios that mitigate material, environmental, social, and governance risks and generate excess returns while at the same time allowing investors to align their portfolios with their belief systems. He's on the board of Ceres, where he chairs the Ceres President's Council. So Bill, thanks so much for joining.
Thanks for having me. It's great to see you.
Cool. So I always like to ask this first question of just your own personal journey, your own story. How did you end up where you are now? What was your arc that took you to forming Stance and doing what you're doing?
Yeah, so it's a pretty random arc, actually.
Those are the best kinds.
And like I constantly I spend a lot of time talking to young people, and they're always like, well, they're basically asking me the same question: how did you get from where you started to where you are? And there's actually a bit of a thread through it all, but it actually took me a while to even understand what that was. When I got out of college, I went to work in the, believe it or not, the direct mail industry. Gabe, I don't know if you know what direct mail is, because you might be a little
I might
young.
have to ask. Yeah.
But and ultimately, like I went to work for a company again right out of school, and about 4 years later, I left that firm and founded a company called Database Marketing Corp, which was really a way to kind of bring information technology into marketing communications, to put it simply. But basically what we were doing was figuring out ways to help our clients use data to competitive advantage. And ultimately I sold that company in, I think, around 2000 around 2000 actually. And we had created kind of a marketing agency sort of that was an offshoot of that. But the next thing that I did was really, like, it was a very kind of a random turn, which involved kind of getting involved in the renewable energy business. And it was as simple as literally driving, source separating paper and plastic and glass and taking it to the transfer station every Saturday.
Cool.
And then starting to think about, like, really what happens to all this shit? Where does it actually go? Because like in the US, we have this luxury of just having stuff go away and never having to think about it again. And the more I dug into it and unpacked it all, I realized that it's sort of this huge opportunity. It's like the only thing that I can think of where in 4,000 years, mankind hasn't really come up with a better solution, because when it comes to waste, we still either burn it or bury it at the edge of town. I mean, that's literally what people have been doing forever. And I launched a company called ZGen, which is a renewable energy company that was looking to take certain post-consumer, primarily wood waste materials, and thermochemically convert it into its elemental form, which is a synthesis gas mixture of hydrogen and CO. And so basically I found myself without an engineering degree running a venture.
I was going to ask if that's what you studied.
No, I didn't. But like I've always known how to find people who could do things that were kind of like critical to the objective. And anyways, it became venture and private equity backed. We were featured on Science Channel, Discovery Channel, survived 08. Actually, we're probably the only, might have been the only up round raised in January of 09, pretty much anywhere. But the one thing that ironically we couldn't defeat was the fact that, like, from the time I launched the company in 2004 or 3 to 2010, the price of nat gas was going from like $12 an MMBTU down to like $2 and something. And so the economics every day were getting worse and worse for what we were trying to do. And ultimately, we just all collectively realized we could not commercialize the technology because there was just no economics, ironically, because of fracking.
Yeah.
And at that point, I decided that like, once you've been in the sustainability ecosystem, I think most people probably never leave. And I'm one of those people. And so I decided, okay, I want to do something in this space. I don't want to have private equity and venture, boards to report to. What's something I can do without having to raise $100 million to build a first plant? And ultimately, I had been sort of thinking about responsible investing for a while, because I thought there was kind of a good idea in there somewhere, but the way it was being practiced, primarily, in the form of negative screening, and that was kind of it, like not even any real portfolio construction, just struck me as sort of non-scalable. And so that led me to start Stance. So I would say, before I get into talking about what we do at Stance, I would say that the one thread throughout my career, even across multiple industries, has been a belief that if you can use data, that you can harness data in unique ways and you can create competitive advantage out of it. And I've been kind of doing that in all of those industries, but that's sort of a tenuous maybe thread to connect all of those things.
Sure. Well, how did it go from, the direct work for the renewable energy company into thinking about the investment side and the responsible investing side? Was it through your interactions with your own investors or with your own personal portfolio, or what did that look like? What was that story?
Yeah, I'd say it's a little bit of both. I think number one, like if you're running an early stage private impact company or a renewable company, you're living in the capital markets. You literally spend, and you know this, right? You spend all your time raising capital, and you might even do it all around the world, which was the case with ZGen. But number one, I became very comfortable with the capital markets space, which I had never spent 5 minutes even thinking about prior to that. And then I think secondly, I sensed a groundswell of interest among, family, of friends, other people in the ecosystem, that everybody was looking to be more purposeful with their capital. And, of course, the fun part of being purposeful is, in fact, investing in private, opportunities, because feels very tangible. It feels important. It's weighty, and it's probably less so when you think about public markets. However, if you think about it from a portfolio perspective or an asset allocation perspective, most people ought to have most of their capital deployed publicly because of liquidity and a bunch of other reasons, stability, and very little of it until you accumulate a lot of wealth in things that are illiquid and tend to be riskier and less understood. And so there's this interesting dynamic in that while impact in public markets feels a lot less sort of tangible, it's actually critically important. Because for one thing, you can't solve the problems of decarbonizing, businesses around the world unless you're tackling large public companies, because they just are responsible for so much of the sort of the carbon that's created and emitted. And then secondly, it is their, I think it's their ultimately their own transformation and ambitions that ultimately create the avenues for the private companies. It's the public companies that are buying the private companies and actually, bringing them to market faster. So there's like a work on both sides of that equation.
I haven't heard people talk about that side. That's really interesting. Yeah, that actually, so that maybe leads me into my next question, which is starting to talk about Stance. What was your thesis when you started it, and what would you say is your thesis today?
Yeah, so the thesis going in was, if you build portfolios a certain way, values alignment can be a free option. So, like prior to that, and by the way, that's for people who choose to take advantage of it. I fully appreciate that there are many people that could care less about employing values into their investment strategies, but notably more and more are, right? And especially more and more people that actually have capital are. Younger people, there is absolutely a groundswell of interest in being purposeful with capital. I think that the problem that we were trying to solve was that it wasn't really clear. Like if you looked at the whole socially responsible investment movement, again, lots of good ideas in there, mainly around shareholder engagement. but you can't scale an industry if you're offering concessionary returns. And not only was it offering concessionary returns as an industry, I mean, it was kind of unapologetic, right? The pitch was sort of, look, you're not going to maybe make as much as you otherwise would, but you're going to sleep a lot better at night. Well, that's great for the 12 people who are cool doing that. But if you really want to scale it, you have to prove that it's free, right? And so that has always been what we have been trying to prove. And sometimes it's easier than other times. I think I'll pause right there because I sense that you're going to ask something else. But that's basically what we set out to do, and that's what we're still setting out to do. And I would say the difference now is that we're also starting to think about other products that we can build besides sort of like our flagship product, which is basically a long only ESG strategy.
What gaps are you hoping to fill with the new products?
Well, one of them we just launched at the beginning of this year, and it's essentially an alternative to cash that's ESG friendly. So, I think a lot of money right now is moving onto the sidelines, and in particular, it's not even on the sidelines, it's actually moving into 3-month treasuries and basically saying, look, rather than deal with sort of, a lot of turbulence and volatility in equity markets, I'll just take a 5% coupon and park it in treasuries, and I'll reevaluate it in 3 months or 6 months or whatever. And so what we launched at the beginning of the year is a market neutral ESG long short equity fund. So it's structured like a hedge fund. We're targeting a return of between 2 and 3x that of the treasury, and we're doing it basically with a beta of 0. So we think that there is interest and demand for products that deliver equity-like returns without equity-like exposure, and do so in an ESG friendly way. So that's the new product that we've launched. The products that we have yet to launch are products that we're thinking about and actually sort of actively looking for the right partners. Really get back to what I was talking about earlier, Gabe, around the sort of visceral satisfaction that comes from private market investing, but the kind of like the need to be kind of like couched in, a lot of like to have a lot of assets be in public markets. I think that there is going to be a new class of vehicles, I guess, which are essentially hybrids, which is to say that they are going to be single investments that contain liquidity of the kind that we provide, coupled with illiquid, impact-oriented investments, which, by the way, could be in a variety of different directions. You could have some that are very squarely focused on the E, and just like an example would be investing in solar developments that are where there is a bondable counterparty, which might actually be a public utility, with 0 technology risk tied to a 25-year power purchase agreement with cost of energy escalators. It's designed to click out a 7, 8, 9, 10% yield, but it is necessarily illiquid for some period of time. You could also go in another direction and combine sort of ESG-ish or, just public equities that have some sort of a values alignment tilt with, say, affordable housing or CDFIs or something that's, really kind of designed to do community investing and to help lift up parts of our society and economy that are sort of like structurally disadvantaged and ignored. And so I do think that, and actually there's a vehicle for this. It's actually called a interval fund. They're growing in popularity significantly. However, most of them have been used in the real estate space, which is also sort of another example of kind of, yes, you can invest in real estate in a public way that's liquid, but there's also a lot of illiquid things. And so interval funds have been used to support the real estate industry. I think we're going to see interval funds getting used creatively to support impact and sustainable action moving forward.
That's really cool. So let me know if I'm hearing you correctly. Right now, if you're an individual or an advisor that wants to be able to create this experience for a client, you kind of have to cobble together a lot of things from a lot of different places. But you're saying that where you think ESG is heading, or impact at least is heading, is putting that all in one product, all in one service to make it really easy to achieve the feel good impact in the private markets alongside the liquidity and the values alignment in the public markets.
Yeah, and just to put a finer point on it, really it's about getting this down to a ticker symbol, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
let's say you want to invest in some interesting solar development thing that a friend of yours is doing.
Mm-hmm.
So you call your financial advisor and you say, hey, I want to do this. And they say, well, okay. But the first thing they do is try and talk you out of it because there's a shit ton of paperwork.
Yeah.
And you're going to get K1s. And by the way, the assets are going to leave their firm.
Yeah.
So they're not wild about that. So generally speaking, there's just a lot of friction in you trying to do that, right?
Yeah.
But even when you do it, it's illiquid and you can't get in and out of it, right? So I think ultimately, if impact investing can get down to a ticker symbol and be both thoughtful around kind of the kinds of things that we're trying to do within the public market space, but also incorporate, specific thematic opportunities that people care about, and it's tradable. And by the way, an interval fund, I should have said, is a form of a mutual fund. So it's gonna have a ticker symbol. It's gonna be, it's gonna have a NAV set at the end of every day, and people are gonna be able to get in and out of them. The way an interval fund works is you can only redeem 5% per quarter. So that's the liquidity. So if you think about an interval fund as being 80% private, 20% public, the 20% is accessible annually, so it needs to be either liquid or near liquid, But I just think I think in order to really kind of fully sort of provide for the ability to democratize, I guess I would say, access to interesting investing, I think that ultimately we need to create vehicles that combine both public and private.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I have like 3 or 4 tabs open on my browser based on what you've been saying just now. Because I think this is something that I was really unfamiliar with. I'm guessing many of our audience members are really unfamiliar with it.
I think that the hard part of this, just really quickly, and then maybe we can talk about a few other things, but the hard part of interval funds is you need to find a couple of strategies that are compatible. Like on the public side, like obviously what we do is sort of high quality, low beta US large cap. So that's with low down capture.
Yep.
It's a very good complement to a private strategy. We need to find the right private strategy, but then importantly, we need to find the right distribution partner, because there are way too many, and you know this by looking at the ETF space, there are way too many ETFs with $5 million in them. And nobody makes any money. Nobody is, consumers aren't getting the opportunity to invest in these things because they don't know about them, because they're not on platforms, and they're just not getting any airtime. And so ultimately, I think to do this right, there needs to be kind of an ecosystem of partners that come together to make it happen around a specific theme.
Yeah. So as a data provider, I have to ask you a data question. How are you approaching ESG and or values-based data, however you want to frame it? And also from the private side versus the public side. I know you have a pretty unique approach that maybe translates better to the private side than what a lot of people are doing on the public side. But I'm really curious to hear how you think about that, especially if they're going to be combined together in a joint product. You still might be able to think of each individual holding an investment separately, but would love to hear your take.
Yeah, so I think the data side is super messy, right? And you know this because you live in it.
Yeah.
There isn't a ton of ground truth in what companies portray about themselves. Having said that, I would say it gets better every day, because I think the ecosystem that sits around companies now, which is not simply shareholders, but it's also employees and other stakeholders. And customers, importantly, very importantly, customers are demanding progress, and they're demanding transparency. And, the nature of data is that once you start unpacking it, it just yields even more insight. And so
Mhm.
There's fewer and fewer places for companies to hide, but they do still selectively, sort of cherry pick what they report on, and they, shade things in certain ways in order to make it look better. And
Yeah.
so the thing that we're doing that I think is a bit unique, and I think it does apply to private capital markets as well. And by the way, the pressure on firms, even private capital firms, to do more and to be more transparent and to have ESG objectives, to report on them, to measure them, and to try and improve on them is growing. And obviously, if you run a private company and you're not beholden to outside shareholders, then obviously companies do whatever the hell they want. But if you think about most private companies, many of them are owned by venture firms or private equity firms or outside shareholders, and all of those shareholders are now asking the same questions that the public shareholders are asking. By the way, in many cases, it's the same people. It might be Sisters of Mercy or Texas Teachers or anybody, but they're asking these questions, which is, tell us about your portfolio companies. What are you doing? And so the pressures are the same, and they're growing in the private capital markets. And that's important because there's fewer and fewer companies interested in becoming public companies, right? It's a place that's less and less attractive. So the thing that we do that is a bit different is we don't use any of these sort of traditional data providers like MSCI and Sustainalytics. Nothing wrong with them. However, we have been using a group out of Toronto called Corporate Knights Research. And one of the reasons why we work with them is that we can actually influence the data that they collect and the manner in which they score the data. I think our view is that companies are not, companies are not good or bad. They are companies that do good and bad things. One of the things that we try and do is, in an unemotional, rules-based way, and based on the industry group or the sub-industry group that a company lives in, is to identify what really are the material risk factors that are specific to that peer group, if you will. And then secondly, how do we weight those material risk factors? So like a simple example is Tesla, right? It's notoriously both good and bad, right? On the bad side, their governance is atrocious.
Yeah.
They've got all kinds of health and safety related issues, fair pay issues, you name it. But on the good side, they're very good on decarbonization. And because they're an automobile company, the way in which we score Tesla is essentially 50% of their score comes from their relationship to carbon, which means that they're frequently be in our portfolio, even though, like personally, I've owned a Tesla for 8 years, and frankly, I want to get rid of it because I now feel like I'm attached to like the brand of Elon, and it doesn't sit anymore.
Yeah.
But we don't let our own personal feelings get in the way of how we score companies. Thing that we do that is even maybe more unique is we counterbalance what companies say about themselves through their CSRs with real-time data feeds from mostly issue-specific, mostly NGOs. Now, not all of them are like, there's a couple of them are actually sovereign funds where we get data feeds, but think of an NGO like Open Secrets in DC that is actually tracking political lobbying disclosure, or political content, from corporations to politicians directly or indirectly through PACs. We actually licensed data from Open Secrets, and we track which companies are disproportionately supporting politicians that, as an example, refuse to certify the results of the last free and fair election, which we think is antithetical to both democracy and a functioning financial markets. But also which politicians are in favor of things like total or near total abortion bans. And so actually gathering sort of unique data sets that we're then using to kind of form out a composite picture of companies. and we use those sort of bespoke data sets to assign sort of score deductions before we do a final quantitative scoring within a peer group. So it's a pretty different approach. We think that it yields better ground truth and very dynamic, because as we look at the world, you know, look, it was 2 years ago, we're like, you know, what the hell, like, you know, corporate, like most politicians are actually majority funded by corporations. And you've got corporations that are claiming to be like good ESG companies. And here they're going out of their way to like pile money into election denying politicians. There's something that just doesn't sit right with that. And also, you know, as I said earlier, I think that there are some inherent risks to our system, and this is one way of helping to expose that.
Yeah, that I'm really glad you brought that up. That's actually something that Your Stake has added a bunch of data, not from Open Secrets, but going directly to the FEC around the political spending and donations. And we're doing a similar thing, mapping it to actually a lot of legislative scorecards from different NGOs to be able to see, hey, are these companies supporting politicians that are voting according to what their expressed values are and what they're saying?
Yeah, the hard part of it, Gabe,
going more in layers and layers deeper and deeper.
Yeah, right. So the problem is that once you get in, it's super complicated, right? Because like most companies give money to everybody.
Yeah.
And it's not so much that they gave, you know, $10,000 to Mike Johnson, the new Speaker of the House. It's more, it's the situations where they are disproportionately supporting bad people that we're looking.
Yep.
You know,
which is very, very rare that there is disproportionate contributions, but it does happen on the margins. I think we have time for one last question, which I just leave it to you to wrap up. This has been an amazing conversation. I again judge the quality of a conversation a lot of times on how many new tabs that I open. So what I would love to hear is closing thoughts. I think you already talked a little bit about the future of ESG, but if you want to wrap anything up, and especially kind of what Stance is doing, where Stance is going, that could be really interesting.
Yeah, I guess I would say that I think that, you know, we're in an interesting time in the ESG space, right? Which we're all aware of. There's a lot of, you know, obviously a massive amount of noise surrounding ESG. Is it good? Is it bad? And, you know, and I think the detractors make a lot of good points. I'll start by saying that. I think that it's a bit of a messy place. And, you know, it kind of reminds me of something I know you're working on, which is direct indexing, where everybody's just like rushing into it, right? It's like it's like the new smart beta. And I think ESG became that for a while. And so you had a lot of people rush into the space with, I'm not going to say bad intentions, but I would just say sort of
some
but some just underformed,
you
know, like intentions, and I would say even more broadly, just a kind of a lack of intentionality in general, right? And I think that it's right for, say, the SEC to start holding people to standards. I think it's right for investors to understand, really, are they getting something that's really, really authentic and really purposeful, or are they getting something that's very, very light, you know? And so I believe in all of those things. I also believe that, you know, interestingly, I think that everybody should feel free to invest however they want to invest. And what we're trying to do is that, look, if you care about some of these things, we've got a solution, and we've got a solution that is fiduciarily responsible. But like, if somebody wants to just invest in sin stocks, they should feel free to do so and suffer the consequences, right? Either good or bad. And so I think that a lot of this kind of anti-ESG sentiment is going to die down, because, you know, maybe not in with some public funds in certain parts of the country, but in general, I just think it's kind of a silly issue, right? Like, if you just think about it, all of this stuff is just data. And you know, we're using the data to do the best job we possibly can to sidestep risks to performance. And You know, and I think that the industry is going to continue to grow, and I think eventually it's going to be like the CEO of Coca-Cola said. I think he was at it, like, you know, the Global Economic Forum or something, and he basically said, look, I get that, like, if you want to tell me that I can't use that word anymore because it's not safe, that's fine, I'll stop using the term. But if you're going to tell me I'm not going to pay attention to the amount of water I use, and
Yeah.
you're going to not to think about and to constantly look for ways to, you know, have less sugar in our products, forget it, because that's my responsibility as the CEO to my shareholders,
Yeah.
not only deliver short term, but also long term viability to our all stakeholders, right? So
Yeah.
none of this is going anywhere. I just think that we're kind of in sort of the, you know, the pimply teenager, you know, stage of all of it.
That makes a ton of sense. We often think of it as a speed bump, but I think that teenager phase makes more sense. There's just a little rebellion, and now we're getting back into it. Bill, thank you so much for your time. This was an incredible conversation, and would love to have you back on. Thanks so much.
Free to come on anytime.